The terminal buzzed with the familiar symphony of travel, wheels clicking over polished floors, soft murmurs of conversation, the distant call of flight announcements echoing across the vaulted ceilings. It was a day like any other at the bustling Atlanta International Airport, where people crossed paths with destinies they hadn't yet glimpsed. Amid the flurry of business suits and hurried families, one figure moved with quiet grace: Imani Carter. At just 17, Imani carried herself with a poise that often made her seem older. Today was a milestone: her journey home after completing a prestigious scholarship program that had taken her far from family, comfort, and familiarity. In her hand, she clutched a sleek leather satchel and her golden ticket, a first-class boarding pass. Her father, Malcolm Carter, had insisted. "You've earned it, sweetheart," he'd said over the phone. "After everything you've achieved, you deserve to fly like the queen you are." Imani smiled at the memory as she navigated toward the first-class lounge, her polished black flats tapping lightly against the floor. Her outfit was simple yet elegant, a cream blouse tucked neatly into tailored navy trousers, her natural curls cascading softly past her shoulders. She didn't scream wealth or status. She didn't need to. Her quiet confidence was enough. Passing through the frosted glass doors of the lounge, Imani immediately felt the shift. The room was bathed in warm lighting, with plush leather chairs arranged around low mahogany tables. A soft jazz melody floated in the background. Businessmen in sharp suits tapped away at laptops. Couples sipped cappuccinos from porcelain cups. The air smelled faintly of leather and roasted coffee beans. Imani found an empty seat by the window, setting her satchel down carefully before pulling out her phone. A message blinked at the top of her screen. "Our Father. Boarding soon. Text me once you're settled. Can't wait to see you." She smiled, her chest tightening with a bittersweet pang. It had been nearly 2 years since she had been home. While her time away had molded her into someone stronger, there was a yearning, a deep pull to return to the arms of the man who had built a life of dignity and strength, not just for himself, but for her. What most people in the lounge didn't know, and Imani preferred it that way, was that Malcolm Carter wasn't just any father. He was the owner and CEO of Carter Airlines, the very company operating the flights she would board in less than an hour. A self-made titan in the aviation world, Malcolm had risen from modest beginnings to become a name synonymous with excellence. Yet he had raised his daughter to value character over titles, humility over pride. Imani shifted in her seat, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her boarding pass. She wasn't anxious, just excited. Everything felt right. She was where she was supposed to be, or so she thought. Across the lounge, two flight attendants stood near the service counter, their voices low but their glances unmistakable. One of them, a woman with meticulously styled blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, narrowed her eyes at Imani. Heather Simmons, the lead flight attendant for today's flight. Heather's gaze lingered a moment too long, her expression flickering with something close to disdain. She leaned closer to her colleague, muttering under her breath. "First class isn't what it used to be," Heather said, her voice dripping with quiet contempt. "Practically anyone can stroll in now." Her colleague offered a tight smile but said nothing. Heather didn't know who Imani was, and tragically, she didn't care. When the boarding announcement rang out, soft, courteous, and efficient, Imani rose gracefully, adjusting her satchel on her shoulder. She made her way toward the gate, merging into the short, privileged line marked First Class. Heather was now stationed at the gate, scanning boarding passes with practiced ease. Her smile was bright and polished for some. As an elderly white gentleman in a tailored suit approached, Heather's grin widened, her tone lilting with warmth. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Prescott. Enjoy your flight." Another woman with a designer tote passed through. Heather complimented her earrings. The friendliness, effortless, automatic. Then came Imani. Heather's practiced smile wavered for the briefest second. Her eyes scanned the boarding pass in Imani's outstretched hand. The words "First Class" were printed clearly across the top, yet Heather's smile tightened into something more mechanical, her body language shifting. Without missing a beat, Heather gestured with an almost imperceptible flick of her wrist. "Economy's down that way, miss," she said crisply, pointing toward the back of the plane. Imani blinked, momentarily stunned. She looked down at her boarding pass again, just to be sure before lifting her chin. "I'm in first class," she said politely, her voice calm but firm. "This is my assigned seat." Heather's smile didn't budge, but a hardness crept into her eyes. "There must have been a mistake," she said, her tone saccharine but steely underneath. "Please proceed to economy so we can keep boarding on schedule." Behind Imani, passengers began to shuffle impatiently. She could feel their gazes prickling against her skin. The judgment, the confusion, the unspoken question. Why is she holding up the line? Heat rose in Imani's chest, but she kept her composure. She thought of her father's words, spoken so many times before. Never let them see you lose your dignity. With a measured breath, she lifted the boarding pass again, offering it calmly. "There's no mistake," she said. "My name is Imani Carter. This is my seat." Heather's smile vanished. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Miss Carter," she said, voice dropping a shade colder, "if you refuse to comply, I will have to escalate this and call security." A hush fell over the boarding gate. Heads turned, eyes widened, and somewhere, buried deep within the hum of the terminal, the storm began to gather. The seconds stretched unbearably long at the boarding gate, each breath Imani took feeling heavier than the last. Around her, the hum of travelers grew taut with curiosity. Passengers craned their necks, whispering behind cupped hands. Heather Simmons, standing stiffly behind her podium, tapped her neatly manicured nails against the scanner. Her patience was wearing thin. "I'm giving you one last chance, Miss Carter," she said in a low, clipped voice, meant only for Imani to hear, but sharpened enough to cut through the surrounding silence. "Move to the economy, or I'll have you escorted." Imani's heart pounded against her ribs, not with fear, but with rising indignation. She had done nothing wrong. She belonged here. Her ticket was valid. Her presence was justified. Still, she could feel the weight of assumptions pressing down on her like a physical force, as if, because of the color of her skin, her very existence in this privileged space demanded explanation. Drawing herself up, she tucked the boarding pass firmly into her pocket. "If you feel the need to call security," she said quietly, her voice steady, "then do what you must, but I'm not moving." Heather's jaw tightened. With a brisk motion, she picked up the intercom and made a clipped call for security assistance at Gate 12A. The request was polite, professional, no hint of the pettiness simmering beneath it. But the message was clear: deal with the disruption. Imani stood tall, her eyes calm, though her hands, hidden by her satchel, trembled slightly. A middle-aged man in line behind her shifted uncomfortably. He glanced at Imani, then at Heather, his mouth opening as if to speak, but he quickly thought better of it and looked away. No one said anything. No one stood up. In the distance, two uniformed security officers approached, weaving through the crowd with practiced efficiency. Heather's posture relaxed ever so slightly at the sight of them. As they arrived, she stepped forward, explaining in professional tones, "This passenger is refusing to comply with seating arrangements. Please assist her with the economy." One of the officers, a tall man with a kind face, turned to Imani. "Miss," he said gently, "may I see your boarding pass?" Without a word, Imani retrieved it and handed it over. The officer's eyes scanned the ticket. He hesitated, frowning slightly. It was clear. The ticket was valid. First class. No mistake. He exchanged a glance with his partner. But Heather's presence loomed behind him, her authoritative uniform, her badge, her assuredness. In the moment's uncertainty, protocol won over instinct. "I'm sorry, miss," the officer said reluctantly. "We're going to have to ask you to move. Please cooperate." Imani felt a lump form in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She thought again of her father's voice. Dignity, even when it's hardest. Gathering what strength she could, she nodded once, sharply, and allowed herself to be escorted down the narrow jet bridge. Each step away from first class felt like a tearing away. Not just from the seat she had earned, but from a deeper sense of belonging she had fought her whole life to claim. As she was led toward the economy cabin, she caught fragments of whispers. Entitled brat. Trying to cheat her way in. Figures. The words weren't spoken loud enough to confront, but they cut just the same. Imani kept her gaze steady, her back straight. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. The officer gently gestured toward an empty seat in the second-to-last row. She slid in wordlessly, her satchel tucked neatly at her feet. As the cabin door closed and the aircraft began to taxi, the reality of what had happened settled around her like a heavy shroud. She pulled out her phone. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard, uncertain for a moment. She didn't want to worry her father. She didn't want to seem weak, but injustice left a bitter taste she couldn't ignore. Finally, she typed, "Dad, they moved me to economy. They said there was a mistake with my seat." Almost instantly, the dots appeared as her father began typing. His response was short but powerful. "Stay calm. I'm handling it. Stay where you are." Imani closed her eyes briefly, drawing a slow breath. Her father was a man of few words, but when he promised action, it wasn't a hollow reassurance. She slipped the phone back into her satchel and stared out the tiny oval window as the plane lifted into the sky. Somewhere below, the world grew smaller, the terminal fading into the patchwork of the city. Up here at 30,000 feet, she should have felt untouchable, free, empowered. Instead, she felt something unfamiliar simmering under her skin, something her father had warned her might come one day. Righteous anger, the kind not born from pride, but from the painful certainty that she had been diminished unfairly, reduced not by her failures, but by someone else's prejudice. But Imani Carter was no stranger to fighting for her place in spaces that told her she didn't belong. And something deep inside her whispered, "This is not over." High above the clouds, the plane cruised smoothly, its engines a low, comforting hum against the endless blue expanse. But inside the cabin, the air crackled with a tension that went unnoticed by most passengers. Only a few had seen what happened at the gate. Fewer still had cared. Imani Carter sat quietly in her cramped seat near the back of economy, her body still, but her mind racing. She stared blankly at the safety card tucked into the seat pocket in front of her, its bright colors and cheerful diagrams seeming almost insulting now. From her peripheral vision, she noticed Heather Simmons occasionally glancing back toward her from the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane. The glances were fleeting, cautious. Heather didn't smile anymore. She didn't need to. As far as she was concerned, the matter was settled. The problem had been removed from her pristine first-class cabin. Order had been restored. Imani tilted her head slightly, her lips pressed together in a thin line. If only Heather knew what was coming. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds adjusted the autopilot settings, everything proceeding by the book, until the secure line rang. The captain frowned. Mid-flight communications were not unheard of, but they were rare, and almost never routine. He picked up the receiver, pressing it to his ear. "Captain Reynolds speaking," he said calmly. On the other end, a voice he recognized immediately answered. "Malcolm Carter, the owner of Carter Airlines, the man whose name alone commanded attention, not just within the company, but across the aviation industry." "Captain," Malcolm said, his tone measured but unmistakably firm, "I need you to be aware of a situation involving my daughter, Imani Carter, on your flight." Captain Reynolds sat up straighter. "I'm listening, sir," he said, every nerve sharpening. In crisp, unhurried words, Malcolm outlined what had occurred at the gate and the unacceptable treatment his daughter had endured. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. But his authority wove through every syllable, leaving no doubt that this was not a situation to be smoothed over with empty apologies. "I expect," Malcolm concluded, "that you will ensure Miss Carter is treated with the respect she deserves for the remainder of this flight. And upon landing, I will be meeting the plane personally." The line went dead. Captain Reynolds sat back for a moment, absorbing the weight of the call. A private visit from Malcolm Carter was unprecedented. The airline's founder rarely involved himself directly in operational matters. If he was personally coming to meet the plane, the matter was deadly serious. With a steadying breath, the captain rose from his seat and summoned the lead flight attendant over the intercom. In first class, Heather Simmons was in her element, or so she thought. She moved briskly between the seats, offering drinks and warm towels with a professional smile that barely masked her lingering smugness. Several first-class passengers watched her with amused detachment. Most had long forgotten the earlier confrontation. It was easy to forget, after all, when injustice wasn't something that touched your life directly. Heather was halfway through refilling a glass of wine when a soft but firm voice interrupted her rhythm. "Miss Simmons," a voice said behind her. She turned, surprised to see Captain Reynolds standing there, his expression unreadable. "Captain," she said brightly, smoothing a hand over her uniform. "I need to speak with you," he said simply. Heather's stomach dropped a fraction. She forced a polite smile, following him toward the galley. There, shielded from passenger view, Captain Reynolds folded his arms. "I've just received a communication from Mr. Malcolm Carter," he said quietly. Heather's heart stumbled. The name hit her like a bucket of ice water. Malcolm Carter. The Malcolm Carter. The owner of the airline. Visionary. Her ultimate boss. Her mind raced furiously. Why would he be contacting the flight? How could he possibly be involved? The captain's next words answered her fears. "He's aware of an incident involving his daughter on this flight, Miss Imani Carter." Heather's face drained of color. For a beat, she could only stare at him, mouth slightly open, her mind struggling to connect the dots. Imani, the girl she had humiliated, the girl she had dismissed as an intruder, a troublemaker, the owner's daughter. Captain Reynolds continued, his voice calm but unyielding. "Mr. Carter will be meeting the plane personally upon arrival. He expects an explanation and a full account of how his daughter was treated." Heather's carefully cultivated poise was shattered. Her fingers trembled slightly as she gripped the side of the galley counter. I didn't know," she stammered. The captain's expression didn't change. "That's not the point," he said flatly. "It doesn't matter if you knew. It matters how you acted." Heather opened her mouth to protest, to offer some excuse, but the words felt hollow even to her ears. Captain Reynolds let the silence stretch for a few seconds more, his disappointment weighing heavier than any anger. "You are to treat Miss Carter with the utmost courtesy for the remainder of this flight," he said finally. "And when we land, you'll answer directly to Mr. Carter." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, leaving Heather standing there, her heart hammering against her ribs. Back in the economy, Imani sat still, unaware of the conversation unfolding just beyond the curtain. She stared out the window, her reflection faint in the double-pane glass. Despite everything, the humiliation, the isolation, she felt a flicker of something warm stirring in her chest. She wasn't alone. Not this time. She pressed her hand lightly over her heart, whispering words only she could hear. "Stay strong. Stay proud." Because sometimes dignity wasn't something you demanded. It was something you carried with you, quietly, fiercely, until the world had no choice but to see it. And soon, very soon, the world on this plane would. The seatbelt sign dinged softly, signaling the plane's descent. Yet for Heather Simmons, each passing minute felt like a ticking time bomb strapped to her chest. She stood rigid in the galley, her hands fidgeting at her sides. Every fiber of her being screamed to flee, to vanish before the reality waiting at the gate could consume her. But there was no escaping now. The only choice left was whether she would meet it with some shred of dignity or crumble entirely. Across the cabin curtain, she could still feel the presence of Imani Carter. Small, silent, impossibly composed. Heather had tried, Lord knew she had tried, to fix her mistake, offering Imani drinks, chocolates, warm towels, anything she could grab from first class. But every offer was met with the same polite but firm rejection. Imani had no need for bribes. Her silence was heavier than any confrontation could have been. The passengers had noticed too. Whispers had bloomed like wildfire throughout the economy section, and even trickled into first class. Heads turned, eyes lingered. "Isn't that the same attendant? That girl's so calm. It's the flight attendant who looks like she's about to break." Heather heard it all, each hushed remark another nail hammered into her crumbling confidence. When the plane finally rolled to a stop at the gate, Heather's breath caught in her throat. Through the small porthole of the galley door, she could already see them. 3 figures were waiting on the tarmac. One wore a tailored, dark suit, posture regal, arms folded behind his back like a king surveying a battlefield. The other 2 flanked him slightly behind, both in corporate uniforms, senior executives. Heather knew without question Malcolm Carter had arrived, and he wasn't alone. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth but carrying an unmistakable edge. Flight attendants disarmed doors for arrival and cross-check. Heather's hands trembled as she obeyed automatically, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought failed. The plane door opened with a mechanical hiss. Outside, Malcolm Carter stood firm, his dark gaze piercing straight into the soul of the aircraft. He was not angry in the wild, uncontrollable sense. No, his was a cold, deliberate fury, infinitely more terrifying. Passengers craned their necks for a better view, the buzz of speculation spreading like static electricity. That's him. That's the owner. He's here for someone. Inside the plane, Imani rose from her seat. There was no fanfare to her movement, no drama. She simply stood, adjusted the strap of her satchel over her shoulder, and walked forward with a grace far beyond her years. Heather watched her approach, frozen, her mouth dry. She wanted, needed to say something, anything, to undo what she had done. But Imani never even glanced her way. She walked past without a flicker of acknowledgement, as if Heather were nothing more than air. Heather felt herself shrink inside her perfectly pressed uniform. It was then that she noticed something else. The other passengers. They weren't watching Imani anymore. They were watching her, watching to see if she would own up, watching to see if she would hide, watching, silently judging, as the balance of power shifted so clearly and irrevocably. Malcolm Carter stepped into the aircraft. The plane itself seemed to quiet around him, as if the very air knew it was in the presence of something immutable. He went straight to Imani, dropped to one knee without hesitation, placed his large, steady hands gently on her arms, and searched her face with deep, fatherly concern. "You all right, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Imani gave a small nod. "I'm okay, Dad." Malcolm let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped inside him since the moment she texted. He rose, wrapped an arm around her protectively, then lifted his gaze slowly to meet Heather's across the aisle. And when their eyes locked, Heather felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. There was no yelling, no dramatics, only a cold, measured stare that stripped away every ounce of pretense she had left. Malcolm turned slightly toward the executives behind him and spoke with the crisp authority of a man used to commanding empires. "Escort Miss Simmons to the office immediately," he said, "and put her on administrative leave. Effective now." Heather's heart thudded painfully against her ribs. One of the executives stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Miss Simmons, please come with us." Heather opened her mouth, desperate to plead, to explain, to beg for understanding, but the words tangled into nothing. There was no defense she could offer that didn't sound hollow, no apology that could erase the truth that had played out before dozens of silent witnesses. With mechanical steps, Heather allowed herself to be led off the plane, her head bowed under the crushing weight of her actions. The moment the door closed behind her, a ripple of conversation flooded the cabin. Finally, some justice. She thought she could get away with it. That girl, she handled herself better than any adult would have. Back in the aisle, Malcolm Carter knelt once again to straighten the strap of Imani's satchel. "You carried yourself like a queen today," he whispered to her. "You made me proud." Imani smiled, a real one this time, small but radiant. Because despite everything, the humiliation, the injustice, the loneliness, she had never bowed her head, and she never would. Not for ignorance, not for arrogance, not for anyone who thought her worth could be judged at a glance. As the father and daughter stepped off the plane into the bright afternoon sun, the first breeze of true change stirred in their wake. And for the first time that day, Imani Carter felt lighter than air. The heavy glass doors of the airline's executive office slammed shut behind Heather Simmons, sealing her fate with an audible finality. She stood stiffly before a long mahogany conference table where 3 senior executives sat waiting, their expressions a careful balance between professionalism and thinly veiled disappointment. The room was cool, clinical, a far cry from the polished glamour she once associated with the upper ranks of Carter Airlines. Today it felt more like a courtroom. Heather's uniform, once a badge of pride, now felt like a prison, tight around her throat, suffocating. An older man at the head of the table, Mr. Aldridge, cleared his throat, shuffling a thick file of printed statements. "Miss Simmons," he began, his voice clipped and formal, "we have received a formal complaint from Mr. Malcolm Carter himself, as well as witness accounts from multiple passengers and flight crew. Heather's hands twisted together at her waist, knuckles white. Another executive, a woman with sharp eyes and a steely tone, continued. Discrimination, abuse of authority, public humiliation of Amino, who also happens to be the daughter of this company's founder. Heather swallowed hard, the taste of regret bitter on her tongue. I didn't know who she was, Heather murmured, desperate to salvage something. Anything. Mr. Aldridge leaned forward, his steely gaze locking onto hers. That's exactly the problem. He let the words hang heavily in the air, their weight crushing. You didn't know, and you still chose to humiliate her because of an assumption. Had she been anyone else, would your behavior have been acceptable then? Heather opened her mouth, but no words came, because the answer, terrible and undeniable, was no. It would never have been acceptable. Not for Imani Carter, not for any human being. The room shifted as the executives continued laying out her consequences. Immediate unpaid suspension, mandatory retraining on anti-discrimination protocols, public apology to the Carter family if she wished to even hope for reinstatement. Heather barely heard the rest. A dull ringing filled her ears, drowning out the legal phrasing, the corporate coldness. All she could feel was the shuddering collapse of everything she had built over a decade in the skies, and it had all crumbled because of a moment's unchecked arrogance. A single instant where she had judged a young girl not by her ticket, not by her humanity, but by the color of her skin. Meanwhile, across town, the headquarters of Carter Airlines buzzed with activity of a different kind. Inside a sunlit conference room, Malcolm Carter sat at the head of a long table surrounded by his leadership team. His face, usually calm and reserved, was grave with purpose. This incident, he began, voice low but charged with authority, will not be treated as an isolated mistake. It's a symptom of something deeper, and if we allow it to go unaddressed, we are complicit. He gestured to the large screen behind him, where a proposed company-wide initiative glowed. The Carter Code of Respect. Mandatory training. Bias awareness workshops. Anonymous passenger feedback systems. New recruitment standards emphasize diversity, empathy, and emotional intelligence. Every employee will go through it, Malcolm continued, from the baggage handlers to the board of directors. No exceptions. His voice rose slightly, fueled by the fire of conviction. We're not just flying people from point A to point B, we're carrying their dreams, their dignity, their humanity. Silence blanketed the room, every executive absorbing the magnitude of the shift their leader was demanding, and none dared to oppose him, because deep down, they all knew change was overdue. At the same time, far from the corporate towers, Imani Carter sat curled in a worn leather armchair in her father's study. The afternoon sun poured through the wide windows, casting long golden rays across the room. In her lap rested a steaming cup of tea she barely touched. Malcolm entered quietly, his presence filling the space without force. He carried 2 plates, warm apple pie, freshly baked. Setting one plate in front of her, he eased into the chair across from her, studying her face. You don't have to talk about it, he said gently, but if you want to, I'm here. Imani stared into her tea for a long moment, gathering her thoughts. It's not just about today, she said finally, her voice steady but raw. It's about every look, every second guess, every time someone assumed I didn't belong before I even opened my mouth. Malcolm's hands tightened imperceptibly around his cup. He hated that she knew that feeling so young. Hated that she had faced it so many times already. But he also knew she was stronger than it. Stronger than all of it. You carried yourself with grace most adults can't even imagine, he said. You didn't let her define you. You defined yourself. Imani gave a small, weary smile. I just remembered what you always told me, she said softly. Dignity isn't given by others. It's carried inside yourself. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, pride welling in his chest. No one can take it from you unless you let them, he echoed. And you, my dear, never let them. That night, Carter Airlines quietly issued a statement to every employee and passenger on its mailing list. Every person who boards our planes deserves dignity, respect, and equality, without exception. We are not only apologizing for a mistake, we are committing to doing better for everyone. Forever. The message spread across social media like wildfire, and the name Imani Carter, though never publicly revealed by the company, became a quiet symbol of grace, strength, and the power of standing tall even when the world tries to cut you down. The city lights twinkled against the dark velvet sky as Heather Simmons sat alone at her small kitchen table. The apartment around her felt colder tonight, its sterile silence pressing against her ribs like a vice. Before her sat an open laptop, the screen glowing accusingly. The email template was blank except for the salutation. To Mr. Malcolm Carter and Miss Imani Carter. Heather's fingers hovered uncertainly above the keyboard. For once in her life, words, her trusted tools of charm and professionalism, had abandoned her. What did you say to someone after you shattered their dignity? After you mistook their grace for intrusion, their confidence for insolence? After you exposed the smallness of your own heart for everyone to see? She exhaled shakily and began to type. At first the words were stiff, defensive, and clumsy. It was never my intention. If I had known who she was. Heather paused, deleted the sentences. No, that wasn't what needed to be said. Not anymore. This wasn't about who Imani was. It was about what Heather had chosen to see and what she had chosen to dismiss. Slowly, haltingly, she began again. I am writing to express my deepest and sincerest apology, not because of who you are, but because of who I failed to be. I made assumptions I had no right to make. I let bias cloud my judgment. And in doing so, I hurt a young woman who showed more dignity in silence than I showed in action. Her hands trembled as she typed. There is no excuse for my behavior, only shame, and a commitment to be better, not because of fear, but because of understanding, long overdue. Heather sat back, reading the words again. For the first time, the apology felt real. It wasn't a shield. It was a confession. She attached it to her formal disciplinary file, knowing it might not save her career, knowing it might not be enough. And she pressed send anyway, because this time, it wasn't about saving herself. It was about finally facing the mirror without flinching. Meanwhile, across the city, another night unfolded very differently. In a quiet corner of the Carter family home, Imani Carter packed a small carry-on bag. Tomorrow she would fly again. A different destination. A different feeling. This time, there would be no fear that her presence might be questioned. No voice suggesting she didn't belong. Not because the world had magically changed overnight, but because she had changed. She had looked humiliation in the face and chosen not to bow. She had answered ignorance not with rage, but with a grace so sharp it cut deeper than any shouting match ever could. Tucked beside her passport was a letter from her father, short, handwritten, folded neatly. She read it again now, a smile tugging at her lips. When you step onto that plane tomorrow, walk like you own the sky. Because you do. You always have. Imani closed her bag carefully. She knew the fight for respect wasn't over. But she also knew now that no gate, no seat assignment, no uniform figure could ever determine her worth. It lived in her stride. It echoed in her voice. It blazed in her silent refusal to shrink. Across social media, the story continued to ripple outward. Though the airline had kept Imani's identity private, passengers who witnessed the events shared their impressions. The quiet strength of the girl in the economy, the way the air shifted when Malcolm Carter boarded the plane. The lesson that dignity is not a privilege, it's a right. Comments flooded in. This girl is a role model for all of us. Powerful reminder, never judge a book by its cover or a person by their appearance. Respect is not earned through wealth, it's earned through how you treat others. The world hadn't seen Imani's name, but they had felt her presence. And that presence was changing things, far beyond the rows of a single airplane. Back in her apartment, Heather closed her laptop. She wasn't sure what would happen next. Maybe she'd be allowed to return after completing retraining. Maybe not. But she knew, deep in the hollow ache of her chest, that whatever future awaited her, it would be built differently. Not on assumptions, not on hollow smiles, but on respect. Real, hard-earned, and never again forgotten. Heather leaned back in her chair and whispered to the stillness, I'll be better. I have to be. And somewhere across the city, as Imani Carter slipped into peaceful sleep, a new story was quietly being born. One where dignity no longer had to be defended. One where respect was the starting point, not the prize. And tomorrow, both women, so different yet forever linked, would wake up to a world just a little bit better because of the day they chose to stand and not break. Morning sunlight streamed through the vast windows of the airport terminal, bathing the polished floors in a warm, golden glow. Imani Carter stood quietly at Gate 7B, her boarding pass in hand. Today felt different, not because the world had miraculously changed, but because she had. The scars of that last flight, the humiliation, the silent judgment, still lingered somewhere deep inside. But they no longer defined her. They were part of her story, yes, but they were not the whole story. Imani adjusted the strap of her carry-on bag and stepped into the first-class boarding line, her rightful place. This time she walked not with hesitance or second-guessing, but with a quiet assurance that radiated from within. She did not need to prove anything to anyone. She belonged, and nothing anyone said or thought could take that away. At the gate podium, a new flight attendant greeted passengers with a bright, genuine smile. Elena Martinez was a woman in her mid-30s, her dark hair pulled back into a neat twist. Her eyes, warm and kind, crinkled at the corners as she scanned boarding passes. When Imani approached, Elena's smile didn't falter. She didn't blink at the color of Imani's skin. She didn't hesitate or shift her tone. Instead, she offered a bright, cheerful welcome. "Good morning, Miss Carter. Welcome aboard. We're honored to have you flying with us today." Imani blinked, just for a second, caught off guard by the simple, effortless kindness. Then she smiled, a true, radiant smile that seemed to lift the entire terminal around her. "Thank you," she said, voice clear and sure. Stepping onto the jet bridge, she felt lighter than she had in a long time. The first-class cabin was bathed in soft lighting, the plush leather seats arranged like thrones. Imani made her way to her seat by the window, her heart steady, her hands calm. A flight attendant in the cabin, Marcus, a tall man with a gentle manner, helped her stow her carry-on with a nod of respect. "If you need anything, Miss Carter," he said sincerely, "don't hesitate to ask." There was no falseness, no strained politeness covering unspoken judgment, only the simple, beautiful recognition of another human being's worth. Imani sank into her seat, gazing out the window as the runway gleamed under the morning sun. This wasn't just a flight. It was a small, shimmering symbol of something greater. Healing, growth, change. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Elena made her way through the cabin, checking seatbelts and offering beverages. When she reached Imani's row, she paused briefly, lowering her voice. "I hope you know," she said softly, her tone intimate and kind. "You deserve to be here. Always." Imani's throat tightened. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words. Not shouted from a stage, not blasted across a news article, but spoken gently, personally. She nodded, blinking quickly to hold back the sudden sting of tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Elena smiled and moved on, leaving behind a warmth that lingered long after she passed. As the engines roared and the plane lifted off the ground, Imani gazed out the window, watching the city fall away beneath her. Somewhere down there, Heather Simmons was working through her reckoning. And somewhere else, thousands of strangers, people who had read about what happened, who had whispered about injustice, who had re-examined their hearts, were changing in quiet ways Imani would never see. But she didn't need to see it. She knew. Because today, in the sky, a black girl sat in first class, with her head high, her heart steady, and her spirit unbroken. Not because she had fought for permission, but because she had never needed permission in the first place. She had simply claimed what was always hers. Far ahead of her, in the cockpit, the pilots guided the plane toward their destination with steady, practiced hands. And back in the first-class galley, Elena and Marcus prepared fresh orange juice, carefully placing a small handwritten note on the tray bound for seat 2A. It read, "Thank you for reminding us. Kindness is not optional, dignity is not negotiable, and respect is a right, not a reward." Imani would find it tucked neatly beneath her glass. And when she did, she would smile again, a smile that held an entire sky's worth of hope. Months slipped quietly into seasons. The world moved on, as it always did, but the echoes of that day on Flight 827 lingered, woven into the lives of those it had touched. For Heather Simmons, the months following her suspension were a crucible. Gone was the polished uniform, the quick smile, the quiet sense of superiority that had once cloaked her. In their place remained only the heavy truth. She had been wrong, deeply, painfully, and no swift apology could erase it. Heather didn't waste her second chance. When Carter Airlines, after deliberation and probation, offered her the opportunity to return under strict conditions, she accepted, but not with the smug relief of someone who had dodged a bullet. She accepted with humility, with awareness, with a quiet vow whispered to herself in the mirror the night before her reinstatement, "I will never be that woman again." She threw herself into the mandatory retraining sessions, not as a formality, but as a lifeline. She sat through uncomfortable lectures about bias, prejudice, and microaggressions, not shifting in her seat, not rolling her eyes, but absorbing every word. She listened to the guest speakers, survivors of discrimination, passengers who had lived their lives being second-guessed and diminished. And for the first time, she truly heard them. She saw them. She saw Imani Carter's face in every lesson. And she knew this wasn't about saving her career anymore. It was about saving herself. Spring arrived with its tentative warmth, and with it, a new chapter. Heather returned to service, not to first class, not immediately, but to smaller regional flights. The company wanted to monitor her closely to see if her change was real, and Heather welcomed it. She no longer cared about the prestige of which cabin she served. What mattered now was how she served. Each passenger who stepped onto her plane was a chance to make things right. Each greeting was an opportunity to rebuild, gesture by gesture, day by day. She learned names. She listened to stories. She knelt to speak to nervous children, offered extra blankets to elderly passengers without being asked, celebrated birthdays and quiet victories at 30,000 feet with a warmth that couldn't be faked. Slowly, reputation shifted. Whispers among the crew changed from skepticism to cautious respect. She's different now. You can feel it. She cares. But still, a part of Heather knew. There was one person she owed more to than she could ever repay. And fate, as it often does, arranged for their paths to cross again. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at Reagan National Airport. Heather had just completed a routine shuttle from New York and was making her way through the terminal, her Navy bag trailing behind her, when she caught sight of a familiar figure. A young woman standing at the arrivals board had her carry-on at her feet. Tall, poised, elegant, without trying. Imani Carter. Heather's breath caught painfully in her throat. Imani had changed in subtle ways. The confidence in her posture, the relaxed grace of someone who no longer questioned her right to occupy any space she chose. But the quiet fire in her dark eyes was unmistakable. Heather froze mid-step. Every instinct screamed at her to turn away, to spare them both the awkwardness, the raw reopening of old wounds. But the woman Heather had once been, the one who looked away when it mattered most, was gone. She squared her shoulders, steeled her heart, and she approached. Imani sensed someone stopping near her and turned. Recognition flickered in her gaze, a brief tightening of her mouth, a straightening of her spine. Heather felt it like a blow, but she kept her voice steady, her tone soft, careful, almost reverent. "Miss Carter," she said quietly, "I don't expect you to remember me, but I remember you, every day." Imani's face was unreadable, perfectly still. Heather continued, her throat tightening with emotion. "I just wanted to say, I am sorry. Still. Not because of your name, not because of your father, but because you deserve respect the moment you stepped onto that plane, and I failed you." A pause. Passengers bustled past them, lost in their worlds, but in the bubble between them, the air was taut and fragile. Heather's voice dropped lower. "I've tried to be better since then, not to erase it, because I know I can't, but because I refuse to be that woman ever again. You deserved so much better than what I gave you." She stopped, hands loose at her sides, offering no excuses, no justifications, only truth. Only the raw vulnerability of a woman standing before her own mistakes. For a long moment, Imani said nothing. Her face was inscrutable, her silence a mirror into which Heather had to stare. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, Imani nodded once. Not a nod of friendship, not absolution, but acknowledgement. The faintest whisper of "I see that you have changed." And for Heather, it was more than she had dared hope. Imani's voice when it came was quiet but steady. "I can't forget what happened," she said simply, "and I don't forgive easily." Heather nodded, her chest aching with the honesty of it. "But," Imani continued, tilting her head slightly, "I believe people can change, if they choose to." Their eyes locked across the small space. For the first time, Heather didn't feel shame. She felt the weight of responsibility and the freedom that comes with carrying it honestly. Imani gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, one that didn't reach her eyes but carried no malice. "Take care of the next girl," she said quietly. "The one who isn't the daughter of an airline owner. The one who doesn't have anyone powerful watching her back." Heather swallowed against the sudden lump in her throat. "I will," she promised, voice thick. "I swear it." Imani nodded once more, picked up her bag and turned to leave. Heather watched her go, a quiet sense of peace settling over her. Not because she had been forgiven, but because she had faced the wound without hiding. Because sometimes redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building something better on top of it, brick by brick, flight by flight, moment by moment. And as Heather turned back toward the concourse, the overhead speakers announcing new flights and new beginnings, she realized she wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was a guardian of dignity, of respect, of the silent, sacred promise she had made to a girl whose courage had forced the skies themselves to change. Months after their brief, powerful encounter at Reagan National Airport, life carried both Heather Simmons and Imani Carter into new orbits. Two lives no longer intertwined by guilt and hurt, but connected by a shared, silent promise to do better, to be better. Heather, the guardian of the skies. Heather had returned to work with renewed purpose, not chasing status, not striving for accolades, but committed to a mission larger than herself. Each time a new hire joined Carter Airlines, Heather volunteered to mentor them. Gone was the woman who once measured passengers by appearances. In her place stood someone who understood, in her very bones, the sacred responsibility of hospitality. At orientation sessions, Heather spoke plainly, her voice carrying the weight of lived truth. You don't just serve drinks, you serve dignity. You don't just hand out blankets, you hand out humanity. The recruits listened, some wide-eyed, some skeptical, but all sensed that Heather's words weren't textbook recitations. They were scars, lessons earned painfully and honestly. She taught them the small things, how a real smile could dismantle a wall before it even formed, how to listen not just with ears but with eyes and heart, how to be guardians of invisible battles passengers might be fighting silently in seat 17B or 4A. And perhaps most importantly, she taught them this. The way you treat the least visible passenger defines you more than how you treat the VIPs. The lessons rippled outward. New attendants carried her wisdom into every aisle, every boarding gate, every quiet midnight flight. The culture at Carter Airlines began to shift, not through corporate memos, but through real human moments stitched together by people like Heather. The skies were slowly, beautifully changing. Imani lifting others. Higher. Meanwhile, across the city, Imani Carter was blazing her trail. After completing her studies, she chose a path not many would have predicted. She turned down the lucrative job offers, the prestigious fellowships. Instead, she launched an initiative called Ascend, a nonprofit organization dedicated to mentoring young women of color pursuing careers in aviation, aerospace, and leadership industries. I don't just want a seat on the plane, Imani said at the launch event, standing proudly at the podium, her voice ringing clear. I want to open the cockpit door and invite the next generation to fly it. She spoke with a calm authority that silenced even the most skeptical audiences. Imani knew firsthand the sting of being judged before being seen, and she was determined that fewer girls would ever have to feel it. Through Ascend, she organized scholarships, leadership camps, and networking conferences. She sat in circles with teenage girls, hearing their dreams, their fears, their fire. She taught them the same lessons she had learned. You do not need permission to belong, you already do. The sky was never theirs to keep. Word about Ascend spread quickly. Airlines, aerospace companies, and even universities reached out, offering partnerships and support. But for Imani, it was never about the accolades. It was about standing in the quiet spaces, the classrooms, the community centers, and telling a young girl clutching a worn backpack, "You are seen, you are worthy, you are powerful." Two paths, one sky. One misty morning, Heather, leading a training seminar for recruits, scrolled through her phone during a break. A news notification caught her eye. Young leader launches Ascend, initiative to empower women of color in aviation. The article featured a photo of Imani, poised, radiant, her smile steady but fierce. Heather's chest swelled with something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Without hesitation, she sent a simple message to her team: "Add Ascend to our community outreach list. We're supporting this." Because healing wasn't just about fixing what you broke, it was about building something better than what existed before. In a world often too slow to change, two women, one who had once stumbled and one who had once been pushed, now carried pieces of each other's story into every new beginning they touched. Heather, the reformed attendant, reminds new hires that kindness is a duty, not an extra. Imani, the visionary leader, reminded young women that they were born to soar. Both were walking different paths, both lifting the sky higher, inch by inch, for those who would come after them. As the sun set behind the endless horizon, somewhere far above, a Carter Airlines jet streaked across the sky. Inside, a teenage girl stared out the window, her first flight ever, a scholarship ticket in her pocket, a future blazing ahead of her. She didn't know the full story of the woman who had shaped this moment, but she could feel it. In the kindness of the attendant, offering her extra juice without judgment. In the quiet pride of the crew, they treat every passenger like royalty. In the seat she occupied without apology, without fear. The world hadn't changed completely. There was still work to do. But thanks to Heather Simmons, thanks to Imani Carter, the sky was just a little more welcoming, a little more just, a little more like home. The grand ballroom of the National Aviation Hall of Fame was ablaze with light. Crystal chandeliers cast shimmering reflections across the sea of evening gowns and tailored tuxedos. Camera flashes popped like tiny bursts of electricity. The soft murmur of anticipation hung in the air, woven into the strains of a classical quartet playing at the edge of the stage. Tonight was a night reserved for legends. Pilots who had flown through wars and storms, engineers who had rewritten the rules of what metal and dreams could do, and for the first time, a young woman who had never needed wings to lift others higher. From the edge of the grand hall, standing among the modest cluster of airline staff who had come quietly to witness history, Heather Simmons clutched her program and tried to steady her breathing. On the glossy paper, under the bold title, "Honoring the New Generation of Aviation Leaders," there was a single name printed in gold: Imani Carter. Heather's chest tightened with a bittersweet pride. She hadn't been invited personally. She hadn't expected to be. But when she heard the news, she had quietly requested to work the ground crew that evening, just to be here, even from the shadows. It wasn't about being seen. It was about standing witness. Because tonight wasn't just Imani's triumph. It was a beacon for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, and for those who had once believed it. The announcer's voice filled the grand hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we honor a visionary who has changed the future of aviation. Not through machines, but through people, through belief, through breaking ceilings that were invisible yet unbreakable for so long. Please welcome the founder of Ascend, a champion for equality in the skies, Miss Imani Carter." The applause that erupted was thunderous, shaking the walls, louder and longer than for any other honoree that night. Heather clapped until her palms stung, her vision blurring with unshed tears. Onto the stage walked Imani, elegant in a deep navy gown, her natural curls crowned around her head like a halo. Her posture so sure, so steady, she seemed almost to glide. The applause swelled again as she approached the podium, her face illuminated by hundreds of flashing bulbs. When the room finally quieted, Imani rested her hands lightly on the podium, leaning forward with the intimacy of someone speaking not to a crowd, but to every single soul present. Her voice was soft, but it carried easily across the vast space. Tonight is not just about me. It's about every young girl who looked up at a plane slicing across the sky and thought, maybe I can go there. It's about the quiet battles fought not in headlines, but in the seats where dignity was tested and sometimes denied. A ripple of silence washed through the room. It's about building a world where your worth is not determined by your uniform, your seat assignment, or the assumptions others make about you. Heather felt something deep inside her break open and heal all at once. Imani's gaze swept the audience. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met across the vast hall. Imani held Heather's gaze, not with anger, not with pity, but with something infinitely more powerful. Grace. Heather blinked hard, her hands trembling where they clutched the program against her chest. Imani smiled, small but real, and in that silent exchange, Heather understood. Forgiveness wasn't always a grand ceremony. Sometimes it was a nod across a crowded room, a quiet acknowledgement that the past would never be forgotten, but that the future no longer had to be chained to it. The night ended in celebration, the air electric with hope. Reporters clamored for quotes. Young girls in crisp academy uniforms lined up for photos with their idol. Leaders of industries offered scholarships, partnerships, and dreams. Imani stood at the center of it all, calm, radiant, unshakably herself. And Heather, blending into the background, allowed herself a small private smile. She didn't need to be part of the spotlight. Tonight wasn't about her. It never had been. But she had helped in some tiny, painful, precious way to build the runway that had lifted Imani higher. And for that, she was grateful beyond measure. Outside the ballroom, the night air was cool and sweet. Heather stood beneath the endless sprawl of stars and tilted her head back, breathing in the sky. Above her, a plane crossed the heavens, its lights winking like a silent benediction. She thought of the girls still coming, boarding planes, claiming their spaces, rewriting their stories, and she thought of herself. Not the woman she had been, but the woman she was still becoming every day. A guardian of dignity, a student of grace, a builder of better skies. With one last glance upward, Heather whispered into the darkness, "Fly high, Imani. Fly higher than any of us ever dreamed." Then she turned, her heart lighter than it had been in years, and disappeared into the waiting night. Dignity is not given by others. It is carried within. The story of Imani Carter and Heather Simmons is not just a tale of injustice met by justice. It is an enduring anthem of awakening, perseverance, and genuine redemption. In a world where prejudice often hides behind polite smiles, where discrimination can masquerade as procedure, the quiet courage to hold one's dignity, whether in silence or defiance, remains the most powerful act. Imani taught us that you don't need permission to be respected. You don't need to prove your worth to those unwilling to see it. You only need to stand tall, walk forward, and let your very existence speak louder than any words. Heather reminded us that real change begins the moment we face ourselves without excuses. No one is ever too far gone to learn the lessons of compassion, and sometimes our deepest mistakes can become the lighthouses, guiding us back to what is right. This story does not end with revenge, nor does it end merely with a triumph. It ends with a world just a little more healed, through kindness, through forgiveness, through the quiet, persistent strength of those who dare to change. And so on every new journey, in every unseen interaction, in every small choice we make. Remember, respect is not a privilege, it is a duty. Fairness is not a gift, it is a right. And even the smallest kindness can change someone's sky. Fly high, fly far, but above all, fly with your heart.